So hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're super excited to welcome Caroline Sinders as our visiting designer today. I'm gonna read a short bio and then I'll hand it over to Caroline. Caroline Sinders is a machine learning design researcher and artist. For the past few years, she has been examining the intersections of natural language, processing, artificial intelligence abuse, online harassment, and politics in digital conversational spaces. Sinders is the founder of Convocation Design and Research, an agency focusing on the intersections of machine learning, user research, designing for public good, and solving difficult communication problems. As a designer and researcher, she has worked with Amnesty International, Intel, IBM Watson, the Wikimedia Foundation, and others. And currently, she is a fellow with Ars Electronica AI Lab with the Edinburgh Futures Institute and a visiting fellow with the Weizenbaum Institute looking at labor and systems in AI and platforms. She holds a master's degree from New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program, and she is currently based in both New Orleans and Berlin. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad and honored to be here. I'm excited to be presenting to you on some of my work. I've left some time at the end, so hopefully we can get into a conversation. Please feel free to ask questions if you are confused at all in the presentation or if you would like clarity. I hope that this feels more like a roundtable and less like a lecture, because we are all equals and adults here. So yeah, and I will get started. There we go. Hopefully my mouse will appear. Okay, oh great, it is, cool. Awesome. So I'm going to be presenting on a principle that guides both my design work and my artwork, so the title of this is very straightforward. It's called Creating Research-Driven Art. I am at times delightfully pedantic, and so I like to be sometimes as straightforward as possible, hence this title. So hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and I work at the intersections of civil society and the private sector. So civil society is what we can think of as NGOs, think tanks, and nonprofits that are either keeping bigger structures or organizations in check, be that like big tech or even different governments. And they also are looking at policy and regulation. So they are working like alongside political arms and like the government arm, right? So that's effectively what civil society is. And I work across civil society and the private sector, looking specifically at the impacts of technology and society and its effects on marginalized groups. And I do this through the lens of product design. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed and IBM, Pioneer Works, the Mozilla Foundation, Harvard University, and I currently sit on a working group with the United Nations on data privacy and children. And I'm an artist with Ars Electronica's AI Lab. I think what's often helpful to sort of contextualize for people is that my background is originally in photography and photojournalism. So with this background in photojournalism, research design, and art, I see everything through the lens of legibility and research storytelling. And these are skills I've honed as a photojournalist. And so with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research, again, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affect people and their everyday lives. So research-driven art is how I define my practice. It's art that is shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. I don't make data visualization, but I could. So perhaps the way to think about my own work, though, is imagine if you made net art or technology-based art, but with the same principles of photojournalism. What could that look like? Like photojournalism, research-driven art uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like how a skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice just as a rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice, nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. In this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art, but it does not dictate the outcome. And a way to also think about it is I view art as many different kinds of artifacts. This talk, for example, is a part of my artistic practice. A workshop is a piece of art. An essay can be a piece of art. a poster, a fine art artifact, a sculpture, all of these things are very equal to me, same as holding a series of community-based workshops to perhaps teach privacy and security. This is what I think of when I think of art and a research-based art practice. In late May, after the United States erupted in protest for Black Lives Matter movement and after George Floyd's death, a number of curators and critics remarked on social networks about how tech artists read, white and male, and what those tech artists' roles were in unpacking technology, injustice, and activism in response to that moment. So I decided to write an article about this. Over email, the curator and writer Nora Khan discussed artistic practices with me during moments of cultural upheaval. Khan wrote in an email, quote, "How might critical technology work be called on in this moment to do more? Coded design work has that capacity. Hybrid research practices can explain and expose the logics of racial capitalism, but under the auspices of artistic collaboration, can enact critique, make an argument through process, through a built system," end quote. This idea of usefulness in interdisciplinary work is a key and necessary part of a research-driven arts practice, and it is directly, extremely inspired by Tanya Bruguera's arte utile methodology, which means utilitarian art. Art draws on an artistic thinking to imagine, create, and implement tactics that change how we act in society, again, heavily focused on usefulness, on tool building, and on communities. Khan in these emails highlighted the strengths of work stretching across domains, making art a necessary Trojan horse to discuss useful change. Personally, this is where I turn to the work of American artists Frances Singh, Joanna Moll, Adam Harvey, Mimi Onawa, forensic architecture, and others. These artists are pulling from research or investigatory-based practices and with work that manifests into a variety of outputs, artifacts, writings, and education. For me, I think a lot about the practices of American artists or an anonymous group that came together to publish police radios and their messages during Black Lives Matter protests in New York City. So this group was called ScanMap. It was a way to help protesters understand when they were being targeted. So American Artist and ScanMap are great examples of social justice and human rights driven art, with ScanMap's current work on tracking police scanners, or American Artist's work, If I'm Blue, If I Was Blank, I Would Die, and My Blue Window. These two pieces comment on the structure and violence of the modern police forces. Other examples of social justice art, research, and artistic practices are works like The Hidden Life of an Amazon User by Joanna Moll, or Adam Harvey's V-Frame research, which came out of his numerous collaborations with the human rights archiving group, the Syrian Archive, which has been documenting on-the-ground atrocities in Syria for over the past 5 years. And also the investigative work generally of forensic architecture, a lab at Goldsmiths. One example of a research and social justice-based art practice is Mimi Onawa's. Onawa's research work on the politics and injustice of data sets have resulted in artworks like the Library of Missing Data Sets and the widely cited and canonical zine, which is for free online, and I recommend you read it, called The People's Guide to AI, which is co-written with Diana Nucera. These artists and pieces occupy a liminal space of research, journalism, and art. Now, these aforementioned works could be viewed solely as art or as research, but are much more richly seen when viewed as research-based artistic activist practices. While that's a wordy description, it rings true of the intentions of the work. But also in this context, I start to view art and design as the same thing. These works and practices aren't just to bear witness, so that alone could be worthwhile. They provocate, they question, they offer a solution to a problem. This should not be viewed as a form of techno-solutionism, however. The solutions, I'm saying that heavily in quotes, the solutions the artists provide are not meant to create an end-all be-all to other potential solutions, but rather they serve to offer temporary or open source fixes for gaps in equity and violence created by society, and thus are poetic witnesses to those gaps. So we could view these works as a kind of band-aid. These band-aids are in a similar space where I pursue my own practice. Band-aids exist as necessary provocations or patches, while participatory design and deconstruction with artists, human rights researchers, activists, technologists, and communities can then overhaul systems together. This togetherness and collaboration is key, though. But nonetheless, provocations within art and design can create imaginaries for new realities. And I'd like to quickly show you some projects and explain where they came from. One project we'll be getting into in a little bit is called Social Media Breakup Coordinator. And that has come out of my nearly 7 years of studying online harassment and how systems create harassment. So I look at the affordances of technology. How do UX and UI decisions mitigate harassment? How can they amplify it? I think that they can. Think about if you were being harassed, what does the system allow you to do? What can you do to create safety in that space? Can you actually be safe? Some of my research focuses on the harassment of everyday users and then journalists who can face really large threats like governmental censorship and surveillance, all the way down to what we can think of as more regular harassment or harassment campaigns. This research work has been supported by different organizations like Harvard University and the Open Technology Fund. And within this research, it also inspires art. And this is the space that Social Media Breakup Coordinator comes out of, this space of studying how content moves online and what we can do to react to it or stop it. And in the case of harassment, how do people relate to then being online in relationship to trauma? How do we as a society respond to being online? The online space are these really structured and heavily designed spaces. So what are the new kinds of anxieties and tensions that come up? A lot of victims, for example, regardless of their technical background or job, because this is something I hear journalists say a lot, and even journalists who study platforms. So they say that they shouldn't be upset by what is said to them online, but you should be. It's okay to be hurt and affected by someone calling you dumb or sending you something as egregious and dangerous as a rape threat. That is supposed to hurt. So as a researcher, I look at these anxieties, and as an artist, I try to create explorations or interventions around them. I'd also like to take a second and highlight, even as a designer, I've worked with different groups like Facebook, like Intel, like the Wikimedia Foundation, specifically on how to create tools to mitigate different forms of harassment that victims are facing. Social Media Breakup Coordinator is a performance art space that explores the very intertwined and interconnections of our offline and online lives. This piece has gone through 3 iterations since 2015. I'm exploring the connections between our digital tools and human intervention. Where do algorithms fail and humans must intervene? As users of social media, people live their most beautiful, angry, and complex and complicated lives online. So within this project, I've been exploring a series of solutions following a breakup someone would have, but the breakup is really with social media. And I help them coordinate that the way that a social media coordinator inside of an ad agency would manage a brand's account. So the idea is I'm here to sort of help this messy uncoupling of algorithmic combinations inside of this person's life. Like an algorithm, I'm creating a series of solutions that can be combined for a variety of situations, perhaps following ending an old job and starting a new job, what happens when you change friend groups, what happens when you break up with a partner, what happens when someone ghosts you, and a myriad of other kinds of situations. Every participant, when sitting with me as the coordinator, signs a legally binding document drafted by my collaborator, Fred Jennings, of Tor Eklund's law firm. This outlines that I am not a therapist and not held liable for damages. Then users fill out a 21-point user quiz, which I prescribe answers out of an algorithm I hand wrote with less than 40 suggestions. These suggestions are puzzle pieced together, so to the user, they feel like they are receiving personal advice when in fact it's algorithmically generated. This puzzle piecing is fairly similar to how chatbots now try to create personalized responses to our own interactions with them on different websites. Social Media Breakup Coordinator is also a comment on the United States lack of healthcare and mental health support, as well as the growing gig economy. In this project, I'm effectively a gig economy therapist, as well as a digital security trainer and advice giver. So for a few dollars in 15 minutes, people fill out the survey and I give them real feedback. While it started with algorithmic feedback, me again mimicking this real life chatbot, it quickly turned into short feedback sessions. And the feedback and the questions and the interactions still pull from my very real research of seeing these general anxieties people face about being online. It was this idea of exploring what is expendable help and how can we respond to the anxiety about the internet when this anxiety really isn't taken very seriously, but it should. So through this, I've created a series of public data sets about these anxieties. In February 2019, I took over Baby Castles again to host an entire month of social media breakup coordinator with new artwork, a video game arcade, and weekly talks featuring Fei Liu, Pamela Liu, Jacqueline Maybe, Charles Bukowski of Arena, Molly Soda, as well as others. Video games installed were Wrongbox by Molly Soda and Aquim, Museum of the Saved Image by Flan, Yet Another Exhausted Day by Candleman Games, Attack of the Terms and Conditions by Mace 486, Wonders of the Internet by Let Off Studios, and Valentine Doom by David Ugg and Sub-Zero. The games themselves, combined with talks and performances, were all mediations on the problems and anxieties within social media. We created a moving algorithm projected on the wall, inspired by our workshops at the end of the exhibit, all while still holding social media breakup coordinator sessions. What you see here is Lauren Gardner, one of the curators, exploring the algorithm we've created during the 3 weeks with social media breakup coordinator data. Actually, what's interesting is me, Lauren, and Carl, at some point, we all lived in Houston, Texas, but at different years apart from each other. That's just a fun note for y'all. Also within this project, I curated a series of posters and art pieces about disconnecting with technology in general and the social media from artists and researchers like Sadet Harry, Merritt Kay, Helen She-Wolf Singh, Salome Asiga, and myself. This is me at my desk as the coordinator, ready to give advice. Later in December 2019, I won a residency with Academy Schloss Solitude here in Germany. And I created a critical design chatbot. The bot was co-designed with Alex Fagea. He built the infrastructure. Alex runs Kamuzi Labs. The bot is designed to respond to questions and care for the victim, as well as a series of open source best practices and guides and what to do when facing a variety of online harassment. This bot is an extension of Social Media Breakup Coordinator. This bot also tells the user it shouldn't exist, but it does, to sort of fill this void created by platforms. That the help and feedback the bot is providing should really be handled by real people and trained professionals on these platforms. But that kind of help doesn't exist. Until that kind of infrastructure exists, the bot will exist. So my work likes to play with this line of being useful, but also highlighting deeper issues at play. I'm going to show you another project. So this is a project called Higher Resolutions, made in 2019 with Hyphen Labs. We were selected as the lead artist for the Tate Modern's Tate Exchange. Higher Resolution ran for 2 weeks in September 2019 and used interactive art, talks from international technology experts, and hands-on workshops to examine the state of power and privacy online, from widespread surveillance to how AI is shaping human culture and relationships to threats of emerging technology that can pose to human rights. Artists and speakers hailed from Amnesty International, Change.org, the BBC, Carnegie Trust, and other international organizations. One major reason I was excited to work with Hyphen Labs was this ability to bring in policy researchers, political activists, and watchdog groups directly into our collaboration. I think it's important when creating activist and social justice work as artists that we avoid replicating unintentionally work done by activists out in the field. Instead, we can work directly with those activists. So we can actually try to engage in participatory design, even if we're building artifacts. So when fighting data surveillance, the way to create change is to work together and create levers of pressure in the public, and arts institutions are a necessary part of that lever. We need to avoid creating work alone, only in the space of art, and we should seek collaboration with other activists and researchers who are working on identical causes. The 2 weeks of programming unfolded across this unique space designed to mimic the different layers of privacy we toggle between in our online and offline lives, as well as a floor schematic highlighting privacy concerns in our everyday lives. The metaphors we were using were the town hall, which is an analog of Twitter being the most public. So thinking of that, inside of Twitter, we're either public or private. Everything we say on Twitter, regardless of our follower account, could technically be shared with all of Twitter, unless we were private. So writing on Twitter, even if we don't get much of a reaction, is much like speaking inside of a town hall because the content can travel kind of wherever. The next metaphor is the park bench, which is an analog of Facebook. So even though Facebook is extremely widely used with a much larger with a much larger user base than Twitter, there are small frictions to Facebook. For example, it's really hard to port content off of Facebook into something like a news article, where it's much easier to insert a tweet into like the CMS system of a news article. Also with Facebook, you have a bit more privacy settings. So for example, I could share something, but with my privacy settings, if Allison and I were friends, she wouldn't necessarily be able to share it. So we're using this metaphor of the semi-public with the park bench. The idea is like a park is quite open, but unlike a town hall where there's like a microphone and everyone can hear you, you could walk into an open park. We'd have to get closer to someone to actually hear the conversation. Inside of the Tate Exchange, we were using architectural metaphors as ways to try to describe digital infrastructure and then also like digital intimacy. So the park bench is this analog of Facebook. The next metaphor is the living room, which is an analog of WhatsApp, being much more intimate and private. So in the living room, for example, all the doors are closed. It's a more private space. But you could hypothetically, depending upon the size of your living room, fit maybe 50 people in there, or 30 people, or 20 people. You can have a conversation that feels quite intimate, but also quite expansive based off the number of people there. And that's kind of what a WhatsApp group can feel like. And also because WhatsApp is an SMS style chatting system, just it has the intimate feeling of just sending a text message versus posting something online. So even the design of that. The last metaphor is the bedroom or the loo. So an analog of an intimate text conversation. If you've ever been at a party and wanted to have a very private conversation, the sort of metaphor was like, you could go to the girls' bathroom and take your friend there and have a much quieter conversation. So the idea with these metaphors was to explain how privacy is not a binary setting, but much more of like turning on a faucet. So there's all these in-between states. Within that, we also then, within these different physical installations, we had different talks and workshops that were placed into the different physical parts of the Tate Exchange based off of how intimate the workshop needed to be. So very public lectures were in the town hall, like smaller workshops, but that could have more people were in the park bench. Much smaller workshops were in the living room, for example. This art installation also spotlights the perils of modern technology like facial recognition, website tracking, and harmful content recommendations. We got to install all of this like less than a year after the Cambridge Analytica scandal in London, which was a bit more talked about there, primarily because Cambridge Analytica was a British company, and British law is different than United States law. So there have been different court cases raised inside of the UK, specifically suing Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. One of those people is Professor David Carroll, who's a professor at Parsons Design and Technology in New York. So David has been going between the United States and the UK, building this legal case. So David actually gave a talk in our installation, which was really great, with his lawyer, which I believe they're called barristers in the UK. So his barrister, Ravi Nayak, and then a journalist named Carol Caldwater, who is one of the journalists with The Guardian in the UK who broke this story. So we were extremely excited to have them all give a talk. And our installation also opened a few weeks after the Great Hack documentary was screened on Netflix, or premiered on Netflix, which David was also in. So it was really kind of amazing to have that whole conversation happening inside of our installation. Also, this image here that you're seeing shows a participant voting on a feature to ban. So we were able to put vinyl up on the wall and people could go through and pick different features they didn't want to see in the future. So it's called Stop That Feature, Stop That Future. And then what you also see to, I guess it's my right, I'm not sure, I'm assuming it's the same for y'all, are tear-off truisms inspired by Jenny Holzer's truisms, but these were specifically on different kinds of surveillance capitalism problems. Um, so the goal of this whole project was to bring in conversations of privacy with policymakers into the white cube space to transform these conversations and make them feel more actionable and tangible for museum goers. So how often does the lead of an advocacy campaign get to engage face-to-face with people that sign their campaigns? Not actually that frequently as you would imagine. And a lot of people in the civil society space actually don't engage frequently with arts organizations. So it felt really amazing to kind of create that space for people. Another example of research-driven social justice art project is my own project, Feminist Dataset, which started in 2017 as our response to the many documented cases and problems in technology and bias inside of machine learning. So it's a critical research and art project that examines bias in machine learning through all the different parts of the machine learning pipeline. So data collection, data training, neural networks, and new forms of user interface. And eventually there will be the projected creation of a feminist intelligence system placed inside of a chatbot. The project is inspired by the work of the maker movement, critical design, arte utile, the critical engineering manifesto, xenofeminism, and the feminist principles of the internet. So Feminist Dataset is this multi-year project using intersectional feminism as a framework for investigating machine learning. It's trans inclusive and focusing on racial justice. It's also extremely process driven. So the outputs of the project or the artifacts are workshops and essays on machine learning. The workshops are key since they are a mechanism to think through what does community driven equitable data collection look like. In workshops, we discuss, well, what actually is intersectional data? What does that mean? How can it be created? We talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work. She's the creator of the term intersectionality. And we also unpack intersectionality in writing. So for example, let's think of an article about income inequality. An intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, and trans folks of different races are all paid different amounts. So an article that represents just all women as a monolith is not intersectional, and that really kind of can't be in the data set. So within our workshops, community members then research and submit written data to be in the data set. The data set itself also kind of functions as an archive. So this data can be things like poems, texts, blogs, like transcripts of conversations, whatever is sort of written text. And the only time my hand appears as a creator is to remove non-intersectional data, and I am extremely firm about this. So Feminist Dataset pedagogically operates in a similar vein to Thomas Twait's Toaster Project, which you see here. This is, I would think of as a pretty canonical example of a critical design project, but I'm sure other people would maybe disagree, but I love this project. So Twaits set out to build a commercial toaster from scratch. And he did this at the RCA under Anthony Dune and Fiona Raby, who are the creators of, or at least Anthony is the creator of the term critical design, and they ran courses on critical design. Critical design, and I think I explained this in a later slide, sort of asks like, what is design when you remove capitalism? So like, what is a chair made without the constraints of it necessarily being sellable? Is it the same? Like, what does it do? So their student, Thomas Twaits, for his master's project, built what you see here. He decided to build a commercial toaster from scratch because of how ubiquitous toasters are. And that includes digging up and melting iron ore to build the circuits inside of the toaster, and then creating a new plastic toaster body mold. It has to like technically function, of which I think this plugs in and does turn on. Feminist Dataset is similar in a way. However, feminist dataset takes a critical and artistic view on software. So much like Twait's, I'm rebuilding things from scratch, sort of under this lens of what is intersectionality. So what does it mean to thoughtfully make with machine learning, to carefully reconsider every angle of making, iterating, and designing? Every step of this process really has to be thoroughly re-examined through this feminist lens. And like Twait's toaster, it actually has to work. The reason I also show this is I think it's a great visual metaphor for what the data model I'll be building of how misshapen it will be. For example, if we all decided together to embark on like, I don't know, like a 6-week project on building a chatbot, we would have to actually pick a particular kind of data to focus on. So if we wanted to build a pizza chatbot, like a pizza ordering chatbot, we couldn't actually use pizza recipes because the written and linguistic structure of a recipe is different than like the conversational and linguistic structure of a conversation, right? Of like placing a phone order for a pizza. So to make an artificial intelligence data model, you have to be extremely specific in what you're using. So if we wanted to build an AI to generate a book, we would need lots of books. But we'd also have to pick genres, right? So we'd have to decide, are we building a book about horror? And then inside of that, we'd probably have to like look at different specific genres of horror. Are books written differently pre World War II or post World War II, for example? Are books written differently in the 80s versus not? We'd have to get really specific inside of our data. And feminist data set is not actually that specific because I'm taking things like poems, which have a different structure than academic essays, which have a different structure than journalistic articles, right? So my data model will probably not look actually, because we can't see it, but it's going to be as misshapen as this toaster is, just software wise. Like it probably won't generate the most beautiful of sentences, for example, or the sentences will probably feel more bot-like, like more computer-like and a little less human. And I'm fine with that because, again, the point of the project is not to create the world's most perfect conversational chatbot. The goal of the project is really like, what does every step need to technically fit this this view of intersectional justice? And what does every step need to do to try to fulfill that? And if it can't fulfill that, then like what are the concessions we've made and why have we made those decisions? Which is what makes from this data set a critical design project. This is an example of when it was installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2017 in the artificially intelligent exhibit. So a current iteration of feminist dataset is this project that I have called TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge, which is an open source project that examines wage inequality and creates open source alternatives to data labeling and training in AI, and is a part of the feminist dataset project, now focused on data labeling and systemic issues around labor, invisibility, and creation of maintaining data structures and data training algorithmic models. So what you see here is this sort of tool interface to try to adjust prices, which I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide. But also within this is an open source alternative and tool that people can use if you want to like label a data set or train a data set. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation and was created with Cade Diem, Ian Arnaud Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. So over 2019, I interviewed research labs, artists, and startups who use Mechanical Turk style services, and then microservice workers like Crowdflower, Fiverr, and Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turker myself for a few weeks. So TRK is this alternative open source tool, again, for dataset training and labeling, this time-consuming but integral aspect of machine learning. And dataset training and labeling can really only be done by a human. It's a kind of intelligence that really only humans can do. The tool here is a wage calculator that helps visualize what a livable wage could look like for those responsible for completing these tasks. So, as an artist who uses AI as a material to explore and make art, I was often struck by how many startups and research labs and artists use Mechanical Turk style platforms, but without any thought given to the payment structure determined for workers inside of these networks. So, Mechanical Turk and other similar platforms have had well documented cases of horrendous worker related issues, like people being severely underpaid for contracts. So, in many instances, even if a lab or an individual is trying to price equitably, the interface of Mechanical Turk works against it since they aren't really setting limits or baselines towards how people should be paid. More importantly, they also aren't asking time. So, how long a task will take. So, for example, if I asked you to label 100 images and I'd pay you $50, that could actually sound like a very good exchange. But maybe you opened the images and they're really big and there's a bunch of things in them. Maybe it's a crowd of people and I need you to label every single person as a person. Then all of a sudden, that task may take a lot longer and it may actually take an entire day. So we should ask ourselves, $50 for an entire day, is that fair versus $50 for something that you thought was going to take 2 hours? And that's what this tool is trying to help do, is like push people towards understanding that time is this really integral part of a pricing structure, and time is completely like left out and ignored in the interface and design of a lot of these platforms that are employing microservice workers, also particularly in machine learning. So if the machine learning pipeline is death by a thousand cuts, think of TRK as one band-aid for one small cut. The project doesn't propose a solution to all issues related to machine learning, or even a major one for Mechanical Turk. So many issues related to machine learning are issues of a deeper, more ingrained societal inequity, which can only be addressed through large shifts and restructuring in society and legislation. Within that, as a designer and researcher, I try to look at what kinds of research or work can help alleviate and expose those issues. TRK focuses on how, through pricing structures, platform incentives, and the invisible nature of gig work, clients underprice, undervalue, and fundamentally misunderstand how tasks are handled in these human as a service platforms. Part of the thinking behind TRK is to examine equity and transparency in interfaces and the design of tools, and what kinds of problems tool design, UX, and UI create in technology. The open source tool also has an aspect to it that was inspired by this really great paper. If you're interested in machine learning, it's totally worth reading. It's definitely an interesting intervention that design students can look at, which is this idea. So it's called data sheets for data sets, and I made a small article sort of inspired by this. Data sheets for data sets is effectively saying we need a labeling kind of system that there should be plain text injected into data models that says like who made it, like how big it is, where did it come from, who worked on it, etc. Like the way that food has like labels to it. So inspired by that, TRK also injects similar information into the data set, which includes a description of what the data set is and when it was made. UX, or user experience design, is a utilitarian intelligence focusing on architectural layouts, usability, and user flows, but design has a politics to it. Design can suppress or uplift content. Design, much like technology, isn't neutral. As an artist, I use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. Very similar to Arte Utile, I think a lot about how design is this necessary tool for making, or rather for letting me make how I want to interact with technology sort of writ large. So I'm an artist that deals with trauma and the trauma and violence of others. And sometimes the tools I use don't quite work well. So what could I do to make them better? An interface is both useful and expressive. I say this to y'all from Berlin. I'm assuming most of you are in the US, but I could be mistaken. One thing I've noticed culturally, though, is how the United States relates to design and then art as different mediums. Whereas in Europe, design and art are viewed much more closely together. Design is viewed as an artistic practice. This is where I encourage y'all to think back on critical design, the methodology of removing capitalism from the structure of design. Design can be a tool, much like technology and much like art, to create political small acts of resistance and change. So, what kinds of design can we make when we stop viewing design through a specific kind of Western or Silicon Valley lens? We've seen code and art made without the constraints of capitalism. I think it's time for design to do that as well. Critical design, social justice design, and design justice are needed now more than ever for tool making and for design to confront how it's perpetuated things like white supremacy and an imbalance of power. In fact, we can use design to then change its own relationships to power. Design can be an actuator, but design alone is not an entire solution towards injustice in society and technology. I think design can confront a problem while acknowledging that it is part of the problem. Design can help visualize or highlight parts of systemic injustice, but design must also unpack and confront its role in contributing to injustice in technology, especially inside of big platforms. I use design as an artistic practice and a lever to create usefulness to explore problem solving. Again, similar to these anonymous programmers behind ScanMap, how they provided a tool for surveilling the police, or how Everest Pimpkin has created a tool to blur images of people at protests. Design can sit in this space to solve small problems that are a part of bigger issues in bigger spaces. So my approach to design thinking proposes a decommodification of art and situate it in a process with art and investigation. Artistic approaches to problems allow for collaborations that might not happen in other fields. This is why art can be a useful Trojan horse. Creating an art project sometimes is different than creating a product. And so these artistic approaches could potentially allow for more interdisciplinary collaborations. And in this way, art's role in social justice and human rights projects helps make space for new kinds of work in a way that other fields traditionally do not let those projects exist. So what does change look like? It has to be interdisciplinary and across many fields of art, activism, policy, social justice, and social justice working together and not separately. Thank you. I would love to take questions. Feel free to write down my email if you have questions or just other things. Here it is. It's just my first initial last name. Great.
Thank you so much, Caroline. They were amazing projects and a lot of great work. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
And so now we have time for your questions. You can feel free, unmute yourself and ask your question, or put a question in a chat so I can ask.
This isn't really a question, but I just am really inspired by the idea of removing capitalism from the design that we're making and just like looking at the real purpose of its function other than selling it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great books. One that was really influential to me was The Critical Design Reader. I think I have it somewhere. My library is right behind me. But also one book I'm about to start reading that I actually haven't read is Speculate Everything by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And that's kind of the like canonical book. Like that's what sort of kicks everything off. I would also recommend Design Justice. I think chapters of it are all online for free. But it's also totally worth buying the book and supporting the person that wrote it. And there's also Data Feminism. I think those are all really great places to probably start. And then I think if you just also search like critical design projects, like interesting things will definitely pop up in Google, because Dune and Raby, they're like a design duo, and they've been publishing a lot of stuff for a while. And so that's how I like found a bunch of this stuff a few years ago when I got started looking into this. Any other questions, or y'all can also just like share thoughts if you want. They don't have to be like, why did you decide to do meow meow meow? Like it can be like, I too like that theme.
I read your article about the biggest problem with Slack, and you talked about a problem that like a friend had. Would you say like your research really stems from these personal or interpersonal like relationships and experiences? Like how has that helped guide your research?
Thank you so much for that question. Actually, my work is not necessarily inspired by personal stuff. When I was writing that article, my editor was like, do you know someone that has actually experienced this problem? And I was like, actually, I do know someone. So that was more of like a journalistic framing that my editor wanted. My interest in online harassment, I think, just comes from being like a person on the internet. And when I was in graduate school at the Interactive Telecommunications program, I was really interested in how do you build tools for community. So in undergrad, so I went to NYU twice. I went to NYU undergrad for a photography and imaging degree. And that degree, we focused on like technology in relationship to photography, which meant talking about social networks and how cell phone cameras sort of changed what it means to be a photographer. And then the sort of bigger question of like, we're all photographers now, so what is photography? And we were having these questions before Instagram. I graduated, and then like a year later, like Instagram came into existence. But pardon me, but at Tisch, NYU Tisch, it's in one building, or it was, now it's in like two buildings in New York City. So I was on the 8th floor doing my photo program, and then the master's program I went to ended up being on the 4th floor. So I spent 6 years in the same building, which is funny because when on the first day of grad school, I like took everyone to go get their photo IDs, and they're like, how do you know where to go? And I was like, oh, this is not my first time at the NYU rodeo. But when I was in undergrad, I was really interested in how do you design tools for photographers as photographers? And that was like not quite a conversation that had sort of made it into my art sort of curriculum. And so I spent like 2 years working as a photographer and just writing a lot about technology. And I chose NYU because there was a professor there who ended up being my academic advisor. His name is Clay Shirky, and he wrote a lot about the digital commons and what is the new common place for all of us. Like, so what is the new like the new urban park or plaza, like where people are protesting. And so he was writing this in response to Tahrir Square, so a series of protests that were happening in Egypt that were also happening across Twitter. And that's how information was getting out of the city, was through Twitter. And so it was considered one of the first sort of real instances that social media was like aiding a real world event. And so he wrote a lot about that. So I was extremely interested in that. Like, how do you design for communities? And then when I got to NYU, I was really interested in like, what are feminist political uses of social media, which sort of led me to pretty quickly to online harassment. Primarily because when you're sort of engaging in like feminist activism, you're often calling out an injustice that is happening and something that's happening in real time. But then also while I was at NYU, I was making video games for fun, and Gamergate sort of sprung up. Gamergate is an online harassment campaign against women and minority groups inside of video games. And because I was at ITP, that's the shorthand of my master's program, learning sort of effectively UX design and how to like make internet stuff, I just got really interested in this idea of, okay, like I see people around me, they're having these problems, and these problems probably aren't new. So like, I want to go back in time and figure out like how problematic these problems have been, meaning people are facing all sorts of harassment and they don't have the right privacy settings to really augment their experiences for safety. this can't be the first time it's happened because I've studied massive political uprising inside of Twitter. So like, was there harassment in Tahrir Square? I couldn't figure that out because I don't read or speak Arabic. But actually what I learned is that there had been like many instances of online harassment previously across many different platforms. It just wasn't as networked or as big as Gamergate. And so these ideas I had as a designer of like the ideas came from talking to my friends, and then me being the delightfully bizarre person I am, I was like, I'm going to interview strangers about Gamergate, but not just like Gamergaters. I mean, like I like put out a call of like, I want to interview people. I wrote a user survey quiz. I'm going to interview a bunch of folks. And what I found from just doing that kind of like ad hoc user research was these hypotheses I had were like pretty spot on, that like most people want more flexible privacy settings. There are these patterns that people are experiencing inside of Twitter. So I like, actually I can probably pull up another presentation. I like wireframed this stuff out and started just doing talks and really writing about how how online harassment has like a UX sort of quality to it in a way. I'm trying to find like I have so many different presentations on like design and justice and other stuff. Let me see, maybe it's this one. So there's like, anyway, so part of my interest was actually just trying to think analytically around this problem that I just was naturally interested in, which was feminist uses of social networks, which then turned into online harassment. But I think just as like a lady on the internet, it's pretty like everyone has a story pretty much of being harassed. Part of the strange thing is, and I'll share this as I'm sharing this, I hope y'all don't mind if I just quickly share this other thing, is that when you are known for being someone that studies online harassment, people tell you about harassment that they're experiencing pretty frequently. So do y'all see this thing? If someone could just unmute. Okay, great. So like I made this in like 2015. And what do you notice now in 2020? That we finally have these UI choices. This is an example of like different privacy settings that I mocked up in relationship to what people were describing to me about Gamergate. And some of these choices are like folded into like algorithmic filters Twitter has designed. I know designers at Twitter have seen these workflows and mockups because they emailed me and said that they shared it internally, which is real nice, I guess. But there's like a reason a lot of this stuff doesn't necessarily get built immediately. A lot of it is Twitter is not, like its code base was not built very well. But then what I have heard from other people who have left Twitter design is that someone at the top was really resistant to just building this thing, like building replies off, for example. And it took like many years of people saying, we need to turn replies off. Like people really need that. And that's why they first started with hide replies, which I believe launched in like 2019. And then replies off has recently launched. But these sort of privacy settings, we kind of have these things, but like not really, like we don't have this kind of level of granularity. This section right here, it says make my account public, but my handle's unable to be tweeted at by non-followers. We now have something like that. We now have make my tweets retweetable, but non-followers cannot tweet at my account. That thing we don't have. That came specifically from interviewing victims of Gamergate who would describe this intense emotional negotiation they would have, which was they'd be facing such an onslaught of harassment that they would have to go private, but they didn't necessarily want to go private. They were forced to go private by the amount of harassment. So the negotiation they have to make with themselves is, I'm being forced to do this thing that I don't want to do, but it's the best thing for my safety. And victims have often said it feels like they've lost something or that they're losing. Inside of Gamergate, when you went private anyway, they viewed it as like that they had won something, that they had hurt you, or that whatever they were targeting you about, they had been right. And so it is this really awful emotional negotiation. So some of these filters, like here you see on this page, like again, I made this in like 2015. So we're finally seeing like the effects of these things, but myself and other online harassment advocates have been asking for these things for a while. Just as a designer, I like to try to make this stuff. This is something I made when I was a research fellow with the Coral Project, which was trying to imagine different commenting sections and like different forms of privacy. So like you could see all comments if you were logged in. So you could have a setting where you decided that if only people were logged in, they could see your comments, and then like replies off. So similar to what you had seen like in these previous slides, I tried to take, again, these varying forms of privacy that I was talking about in the last talk and really try to put them into wireframes. And then this was made because the Coral Project was an initiative funded by the Mozilla Foundation to look at harassment in the commenting sections. And we were working with the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so I was invited in for like 2 months to do a hyper special project, which was like, can you research harassment that journalists are facing? So that's what kicked off me looking specifically at journalists. And can you make these like wireframes? And I was like, yes, I can do both those. Or can you wire up something that, that we could show? And again, as I was saying earlier, I get DMs like this pretty frequently because I'm like inside of different people's networks. Like I am the expert on online harassment. I work across, I've said, like human rights and civil society. So even my friends who are what are called security trainers, they work with activist groups. So imagine like a nonprofit in Malaysia that is on like queer identity. My security trainer friends will work with that nonprofit to make sure that that nonprofit, that their emails are secure, that their texts are secure. And I'm still the person that security trainers come to when there's an online harassment problem. So I show that mainly to just sort of say, like, I have a plethora of stories that people have faced in online harassment because I'm just like an expert people go to.
Caroline, on the topic of harassment and safety in digital spaces, I'm curious if you have something to share with, so for students who are interested in UX design, but I mean, in addition to straightforward privacy settings, what would you tell them to keep in mind or to do if they are interested in preventing harassment and engendering safety in those digital spaces that they design?
Well, I can pull up the presentation I gave at Facebook if y'all just want to see like a few sections of how I try to get people to think about safety. How are we doing on time? Because
I think we just have a couple minutes left.
Okay. I have lots of time, but I don't want to take up y'all's time. Let me see if I can find this real fast. I wish there was a faster way to search. Let me try this. I would say a big thing is you have to think about asymmetries of power. That's why I want to pull up this presentation. So this is something I was actually talking about earlier with a design group called Project Inkblot. And so there are many different kinds of harassment. Harassment can be extremely contextual and extremely obvious. Contextual harassment could be something like you're posting something and then someone responds to you and they say like, I love the like green shirt you're wearing. And you're like, I didn't tell anybody I was wearing a green shirt, right? And like that would be like probably pretty scary and pretty jarring. But to someone that works on the content moderation team or the trust and safety team, there's not enough context in that piece of content for an outsider, for them to like understand why that's scary. So like there is like a few things to think about when you're designing for a person. A big thing is to try to keep in mind like cultural context. So for example, with Facebook, like if you are a user and you're in a different country. So for example, there was this problem on Facebook where Indian women were not joining the platform at the same rate as like the way that other women tend to join the platform when they like introduce it into a new country. What they realized is that a lot of men were using Facebook to like randomly message women and sort of using it as a dating platform. And that was like adding to women like leaving the platform because it was like jarring and uncomfortable. And so like a thing to keep in mind is like inside of a space, maybe like a country that has like a bit more of restrictions, or maybe it's illegal to be, for example, queer, like what are the cultural contexts that sort of either endanger someone or could expose them? So the thing to think about is first, like, who is your user? And then like what is a marginalization that they face? And then inside of like the legal space they're in or the cultural space they're in, how does that marginalization affect them even more, right? In the human rights world, there's lots of really specific cases. So for example, the Rohingya who are being like murdered and are genocided against inside of Myanmar, like being Rohingya in Myanmar is an extremely sort of vulnerable identity to have. So even just posting something, even without context, even just posting anything on Facebook, they're probably facing more and more harassment. So like you need to sort of bear in mind someone's identity, and then also like the identity or the cultural identity that they have. And then inside of that, you still need to think about like vectors of communication. Let me see, I think, here we go. So then another thing to think about is like, we as designers, especially I would argue inside of like tech, we kind of view our interactions or our design in like a positive way of like, I'm building a platform and it's for people that love bicycles and everyone's gonna love it because bicycles. And you don't necessarily think about what about the bicycle harassers inside of the bicycle subculture, right? Like unicycles versus fixies, and they hate each other. And you have to think about that. Like any space, like any digital space that allows people to interact, there could be harassment. There's probably lots of harassment on Venmo. We just don't know about it, for example. So if I were designing something as a student, the first thing I would think about is like the person you're designing for, don't just design it for your friends, but add in this context of what about like a queer person in a country that has like a more repressive government, or like a journalist in a country that's facing censorship, and then run through these kinds of harassment. So how could someone like hurt your queer person inside of a repressive culture? And imagine if it's like one-to-one, the victim doesn't know their harasser and it's like bullying. What would they need to stop that? What if it's one-to-many and they do know their harassers, but it's happening online? Like what would they need to stop that? What if it's one-to-many harassers, a bit like and it's happening just randomly? So like a journalist posting an article, and the second they post it, they're getting a bunch of harassment, and then it dies down a few hours later, and then they post something else, and then it's fine. And then what would they do in a large scale coordinated attack? And I present these because I'm taking a kind of similar methodology that security engineers take when they test the robustness of their code. But I'm doing this as like a designer, thinking through what is the robustness of my design. So what is my harassment audit that I'm going to do? The best thing you can also do is just ask yourself internally, what could possibly go wrong, and map it from like the banal to the extreme. So in a class with Clay Shirky, we had like conceptualized a bike sharing app. And Clay was like, okay, what are you going to do if someone steals the bike, sells drugs on the bike, and lights the bike on fire and like pushes it in the East River? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, well, you should come up with a plan because that's going to happen. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And I would like recommend thinking that out as well. Like what would you do if someone accidentally got hit by a car on the bike? Like who's responsible, right? How would your app or the governance system inside of your app respond to that? What would you do if the bike gets stolen? What would you do for a variety of cases? And so just think about like what could possibly go wrong and really map all of them out. And then ask people that don't look like you, what are other concerns they would have inside of that app. So really try to take an intersectional lens on it. That would be my suggestion.
I think we're almost out of time. If we have one more question, does anyone want to throw out one final question?
No pressure.
There's a question in the chat from Molly.
Oh, yeah.
She said, you spoke about online harassment and its impact on society. How do you see this playing into AI and machine learning?
Oh, I have a whole essay on that called Machine Learning Harassment. I mean, so machine learning has been used inside of content moderation and filters inside of social networks like on and off for a while, and it's gotten more popular during COVID-19 as there's been global stay-at-home orders. The thing about, again, harassment is it's super contextual. So like, if you, okay, the best example I have, and this is such a bad one, but is like, how, like, what is, so there's a problem called the Scunthorpe problem. So what is a word inside of Scunthorpe? Just like write it out. So I apologize for my language. The word inside of Scunthorpe is the word cunt. And Hotmail in the mid 90s did these keyword replacements or blocking. So like of basic curse words without realizing that they had also blocked words that encapsulate those words from starting email accounts. So the entire city of Scunthorpe, England could not sign up for Hotmail accounts. Another example I love is, do you know what bigger word the word meow is in? It's in homeowner. So like when people like, and I present these as like, there are a lot of things that go wrong when we like over text stuff. And so this is why I advocate for like user agency. So like instead of Twitter deciding that the word meow should be a filter, like let me decide that. Like I can make those decisions, I can turn it off and I can turn it on. Specifically with like harassment, again, like someone could say something to you and it may be so specific to like what you're experiencing that like it would be hard to train an AI filter on it, right? But like you could explain like what it is. Generally, and there's probably not enough time to go in this, AI has a lot of problems with bias inside of machine learning. So it's very imperfect. And so if we're using AI as filters and ways to analyze human problems, we're creating an extremely unjust society. So like AI doesn't understand like AAVE, so like African American vernacular. It doesn't understand it at all. Artificial intelligence systems that use computer vision have a really hard time recognizing race and gender. So if we're using that inside of surveillance systems, that's also bad. Predictive policing algorithms who are using artificial intelligence are doing this based off, again, of like historically like racist over policing of Black and brown neighborhoods, which means if you're using that data to create a model on like how to give people sentencing, like Black people are over sentenced. We've seen this in New Orleans. The ProPublica did a really big investigation of this, I think in Ohio. So generally just like AI inserted in something that's really directly dealing with people, and then like the context or the interactions of people is often like a bad idea.
Yeah, that's a really deep and wide conversation that we could have.
Totally.
Well, maybe we can tap into that a little bit on Monday in your workshop
Yeah.
with the seniors who are here. But I think that's all the time we have. So we should wrap it up. Thank you so much, Caroline. This
Yeah,
is really
thank you.
wonderful.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good Friday.
Yeah, and we'll see you on Monday in our technology and context class.
Sounds good.
Bye.
All right. Bye.